Hare Krishna. Now, this is your servant Malati Devi Dasi speaking, and I've been asked to say a few words about His wonderful divine grace. So they also asked me for a title. I don't usually give titles to my little talks, but the title of this is Srila Prabhupada, Glimpses into a Radically Wonderful Person. So I will begin with a very brief intro, which I've often repeat because I think the message is important. Exclusive loyalty to Srila Prabhupada is not fanaticism. So sometimes ISKCON gets criticized for being too focused on Srila Prabhupada. In fact, this very day, I saw something to that effect on Facebook. They claim that we are narrow-minded or fanatical, but we know and we honor all saintly Vaishnavas, spiritual teachers and seekers of the truth. As members of ISKCON, however, we are bound heart and soul to the teachings of Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as expounded and taught to us by His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada. So I want to express a few words to that effect. Following the departure of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, many saintly acharyas continued carrying on his message, but gradually the Sampradaya fell into disarray, with many Aprasambradayas and concocted philosophical deviations and rituals occurring. And eventually, the Vaishnavas became completely ignored and rejected by the respectable public, and the message of Mahaprabhu, the pure message, became completely lost. Srila Bhakti Vinod Thakur appeared in the 1800s, and by divine guidance, as a seeker of the truth, he came into contact with the Chaitanya Chaitamrita, which completely transformed his life as well as ours. It became his mission to expose the bogus followers, and his efforts were assisted by his son, who became known as Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And together they were preaching fearlessly about the glories of the Sankirtan mission, far and wide within the borders of India. However, in 1896, a small book written by Srila Bhakti Vinod Thakur in English, The Life and Precepts of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, made its way outside the borders of India, into countries like England and Canada, thus in a small way expanding the possibility of spreading the teachings of Lord Chaitanya all over the world, as he himself predicted. 1896 was also the year of our Srila Prabhupada's appearance into this world. And it was into this mood of vast preaching of the message of Mahaprabhu that A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami entered, becoming the initiated disciple of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. As such, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada is not just another name and picture in the line of disciplic succession, because he accomplished something no other previous acharya had ever done. In total dedication to his guru, he fulfilled the mandate of Lord Chaitanya by spreading Krishna consciousness all over the world, outside of India. No one else can ever make that claim to distinction. It is a record that cannot be broken. We call it standalone, a record that can't be broken, standalone record. No one else can ever make claim to that distinction. It says in this Chaitanya Chaitamrita that no one can successfully preach the Sankirtan movement without being specifically empowered by the Lord. And such a person is known as Saktavesh Avatar, specifically empowered by the Lord to fulfill a particular mission. So Srila Prabhupada did that. It is a fact, and it remains without dispute. An acharya is one who teaches by example. Srila Prabhupada never claimed fame or prestige for his accomplishments. When asked about his successes, he would modestly say, "If I have done anything, it is that I've always followed the teachings of my spiritual master. I have not deviated. It is by his mercy only there is any success." He was always 100% loyal to his spiritual master, as is expressed in Srimad Bhagavatam by Sri Prahlad in 7.9.28. My dear Lord, O Supreme Personality of Godhead, because of my association with material desires, one after the other, I was gradually falling into a blind well full of snakes, following the general populace. But your servant, Narada Muni, kindly accepted me as his disciple and instructed me how to achieve transcendence. Therefore, my first duty is to serve him. How could I leave his service? So much is packed into this simple statement, but I will focus on the beautiful relationship between Prahlad and Narada Muni, his guru. Nothing could deviate Prahlad from the service and surrender to Narada Muni, even when his very life was being threatened in ways we cannot even imagine. He remained fixed and composed. He didn't go outside seeking the advice of ill-informed fools or take to any concocted practices to try and figure out why all of this was going on. He remained loyal to the instructions and services of his guru, giving all loyalty to him without division. And this same loyalty was exemplified by our Srila Prabhupada in all instances without compromise. Now, when I say our Srila Prabhupada, I'm saying like that to distinguish from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, so our Srila Prabhupada. So I want to give an example that has remained close to my heart throughout my life as a devotee in all circumstances. And it occurred in 1967, July, in San Francisco. And at that time, Srila Prabhupada had already been very ill for a few months, and the devotees had tried to assist and promote his recovery. First starting in the East Coast, and then he came over to San Francisco. We got him a cottage in Marin County along the water, along the ocean. And although it was a pleasant arrangement, he wasn't really recovering. So one day we got the message, and just to tell you, during that period, the first Rath Yatra festival outside of India was performed in San Francisco. And Srila Prabhupada himself, who had induced the entire project, wasn't able to attend. Actually, what happened was the next day, we brought Jagannath, Subhadra, and Baladev to Stinson Beach to see Srila Prabhupada, and they stayed there for 3 days, standing on a master grand piano as an altar. So he told us that he had decided he would go back to India to recover, to try to recover his health. And then he said, I'm an old man. I may die at any time. So I want you, boys and girls, to push on this movement. That was quite shocking, actually. Just old man. Like, yeah, he was 70 plus, qualifies as old, but we never saw him as old. He never felt like an old man to us. The old people in our lives were pretty inactive, sitting on a front porch in a rocking chair, sitting on a chair in front of a television. So to us, that was old. Srila Prabhupada, although he was of similar age, was not old. At least we didn't think of him that way. In fact, as young people at that time, we had a motto. And our motto was, don't trust anyone over 30. Somebody who was older than 30, oh, don't trust them. I can tell you, in San Francisco, a lady came to the temple. She was 37 years old. We were thinking, what does this old lady want? So he said, I'm an old man. I may die at any time. Well, certainly we've heard the mantra by now. I mean, aside from the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, birth, death, disease, and old age. We all know that mantra. But none of us had really experienced death yet. But even that part, okay. But then he ended up by saying, I want you boys and girls to push on this movement. We were boys and girls. The oldest devotee at that point was 27 years old. Push on the movement. We weren't even comprehending that we were part of a movement yet. Just that little storefront in New York, our little storefront in San Francisco. There weren't even 100 of us. There were barely 50 of us. But he was far ahead of us in knowing what was to come. And he was, in essence, handing over the future of the Hare Krishna movement to a bunch of kids who didn't know what would be happening at the end of the day, what to speak of the next day, what to speak of the future. So we were thinking, when he's here, we felt fully protected. He had sent us out preaching the day we were initiated. In fact, when I was initiated, he said, now you go out and preach. There were 4 of us. And I raised my hand, so how do we do that? And he just said, you listen to me. And whatever you hear, you repeat. Don't add or don't subtract. Don't concoct. Simple instructions. But he was there. His presence was there, either in San Francisco or New York. We could call. We could write. The saying goes, he had our back. But now he's saying he's leaving. Doesn't know if he's going to come back. He may not come back at all. And he wanted us to push on this movement, which we had not really considered as a movement. We were just the boys and girls with Swamiji. You know, us against the world. We weren't thinking too much about saving the world at that point, but he always was. So the question was proposed, not by way of replacing him, but by way of fulfilling his instructions to push on the movement. We felt we were inadequate. We didn't have the ability to do that. And we know before Srila Prabhupada came to America, he had requested some of his god brothers and other Gaudiya Vaishnavas to come and help preach. Nobody came. They all had some reason why not, and some didn't even answer. But we were thinking, maybe if somebody came to help us, we could push on this movement. So that question was put to him. Srila Prabhupada, when he heard that question, became even more still and more grave than he already was. It was one of those moments being like 12 years or more. And when he spoke, it was in a low voice. He said, my spiritual master is not an ordinary man. He saved me. There was no personal agenda or pride. He was giving full credit and loyalty to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. And he went on to say, if even one person were to come and change even one word of what he has taught us, the whole thing would be spoiled. He was protecting us and protecting ISKCON in our early stages of infancy. ISKCON was not even a year old at that time. Is it fanatical for a parent to hold tightly to the hand of a young child when crossing a dangerous street? It's their duty. One should not become a guru if they cannot save their dependents from repeated birth and death. Srila Prabhupada saw how his godbrothers had ignored his early attempts to work cooperatively and spread Krishna consciousness. And now he had heard their criticisms that Swami Maharaj had left India for America, associating with the Malechas. And now there was some success. Their interest would not be to help, rather to gain control by interfering. He could understand what we could not, and later incidents proved this to be a fact. He continues by instructing us, everything I have to teach you is in these books. These books were the first 3 volumes of the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, carefully brought over on the Jaladuta. He asserts that he's an old man who may die at any moment. And he further instructed, I want you boys and girls to push on this movement. As mentioned, he was leaving the future of the Hare Krishna movement, ISKCON, in the hands of children who could barely understand what was happening then, let alone what would happen in the future. It's actually our amazing good fortune to be counted as his disciples, his grand disciples and followers into the future. And it is our duty to remain loyal to his teachings and legacy so that we may proudly cherish the future of ISKCON. Only a few short years ago, we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of year ISKCON. Many of you will be around for the 100th year Jubilee. So please mark these instructive words and remain a loyal follower of Srila Prabhupada and ISKCON. And by doing so, take the credit for pushing on this mission. Srila Prabhupada has empowered, and he will empower anyone who takes to Krishna consciousness with sincere faith and determination, the ability to further this mission simply by carrying out his instruction. So I wanted to mention a few incidents that were part of my life with Srila Prabhupada, giving glimpses into Srila Prabhupada, the person. We hear about Srila Prabhupada, the Acharya, the great teacher, the great author, the great orator, speaker. He was dubbed the ambassador of Bhakti Yoga to the West in an early publication. So he has this, academia has recognized him. But another aspect that isn't always known or seen or heard or tasted is Srila Prabhupada, the person. Probably most people by this time know a little bit about how an initiation happens. So I'll tell you how it happened for myself and 3 other devotees in San Francisco in January of 1967. Srila Prabhupada had come to San Francisco a day or 2 before, taking an airplane for the first time, because he came over on a ship, not a convenience luxury liner, but a cargo ship. So first time on an airplane, he flew to San Francisco, stopping in Chicago, I believe, and then from New York, Chicago, and then onward to San Francisco. And then a couple days later, there was our initiation. And what did we know about an initiation? Practically -0. The elder devotees were just a few minutes ahead of us in terms of their devotional service. The first initiation happened in New York on Janmashtami of 66. The second initiation was on Radhastami, 15 days later of 66. So now we're coming to the third initiation and the first one in San Francisco. There were a few boys that had come from New York to San Francisco, mostly on the pretext of guarding Srila Prabhupada from the San Francisco heathens. But I was handed a list, and the items on the list, I was supposed to bring some pieces of wood, some sand, 5 pounds of butter. Yikes, 5 "What's that for?" I asked. The boy tells me, "It's going to be put on the fire." I looked at him and said, "What a waste." Some colored powder, some fruits, bananas specifically, and some bricks. So that was put together, and we had made quite a lot of announcements about this, so there were, practically speaking, no space to sit in the temple. People came so much to see what was going to happen. This Vedic fire ceremony. We thought it was kind of cool that we were going to have a fire inside of the building. We almost knew the words to the mantra. When I say almost, we knew the Hare Krishna Rama, but sometimes we get them a little mixed up. I don't think you could even call us neophyte. We were pre-neophyte. We had a little piece of paper with the mantra written on it just in case we got confused. The members of the audience were asked to chant. And in the same kind of mixed up way, the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra was being chanted. We had told there should be lots of incense, so literally speaking, there was a cloud that hung above the entire room. And at that time, Srila Prabhupada's English was still pronounced by a strong accent. He knew English, but the Bengali accent mixed with the Scottish accent, because he'd gone to school in the Scottish Church College, right? So he had this little bit of a tinge of a Scottish accent mixed with the Bengali accent. So it wasn't always something we would immediately understand at that point. He's chanting words of a mantra. We're all trying to chant the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. He gives a brief introduction. And then it was time to put on the Kunti Mala, the neck beads. But in those days, we called them Swamiji's dog collar. We felt like when these beads went around our neck and were tied tightly, which they were, there was no little clasp to screw or unscrew, forever tied, never to be removed. And we felt ourselves the dogs of the Guru. The beads were coming closer to the neck. And I started thinking, oh my God, what's going on? And I looked up and I saw over to the left the door. And the thought flickered across my mind, well, you can always go, you can leave, you know. But I didn't. The neck beads came on, and one by one we were called up and given a new name, which we could barely understand either. But we took to heart that we would get it sooner or later, sat down, and were handed a banana. What do you do with a banana? We're looking around and nobody told us, so we started peeling the bananas. At that point, Swamiji, and then we were told the bananas should go in the fire. Then he said something which again we couldn't understand. Badum, badum, that's what it sounded like, badum, badum. We're looking. So we looked at Haridas, that former Harvey Cohen. He just became Haridas. And he was going to be our temple president. And he had been in New York with Swamiji. That's where he met him. So we were sure he would know what to do. So we looked at him. He got on his knees and bent forward. There were four of us. We got on our knees and bent forward. And he began blowing on the fire. Because there was so much smoke from the incense and the fire, kind of like made a little gap in the fire. And on the other side, we saw Swamiji with his eyes looking hugely wide, like, what's happening? it's not that, you know, we had a saying in those days, oh, that blew my mind. Like when something that we considered to be really outrageous or far out, sometimes we'd say far out, oh, that was far out. But if it was really far out, if it was really outrageous, we'd say, oh, that blew my mind. Nothing could blow Swamiji's mind. He was grounded in Krishna's association. After all, his best friend was a 7-year-old kid who could lift an entire mountain with the small finger of his left hand. What could we do? You know, that would be astounding. But we could see we had done something that wasn't quite right by his expression and those big eyes. It turns out he was trying to instruct us to bow down. That he would even have to tell us to bow down, indicates how far behind we were, you know. But he was undisturbed. He picked up the kartals and he began a kirtan. And later on we could only marvel at his extraordinary mercy being given to such young, foolish people. At that same time, actually 2 days later, then there was another fire yajna. This time it was the marriage of myself and Shamsundar, the second marriage in ISKCON. I won't go into that, but there were no saris, there were no dhotis. So Shamsundar had a new pair of Levi's, black Levi's, and I borrowed Janaki's sari. Janaki and Mukunda were the first marriage in New York City. So the only sari available was Janaki's sari. So I wore that sari also for my wedding, and 3 other ladies also borrowed that sari. When it came time to tie us together, I was tied on the belt loop of the Levi pants. And we were told you can't not separate. And that was all well and good until one of us had to go to the bathroom. Anyways, just a few days after that, we had an extraordinary example of what I can only claim, Maha Mercy of the spiritual master. Just like Prabhupada, we'd already heard this. He said, if you see Nityananda go into a bar, do not think he's going to drink. In other words, it so happens if we observe a saintly Vaishnav in an unusual circumstance, we should refrain from criticism. So shortly after his arrival in San Francisco, Srila Prabhupada entered into the infamous Avalon Ballroom, where every single regulative principle was being broken and not necessarily hidden in full sight. Why were we there? Well, we were coming to spread Krishna consciousness, and a little more so, we were hopefully going to get some money to continue our little efforts. So it happened to be that we were friends with many of the rock and roll people of that era, and they had agreed to do a benefit on behalf of the fledgling temple. So Prabhupada was asked to go, and along with him was Allen Ginsberg, or as Srila Prabhupada would say, Mr. Ginsberg. For those who don't know, he was what they call a beat poet. Before hippies, there were beatniks, so he was a beatnik. And those people were very interesting. They were always talking about life and transcendence, but they didn't know anything. They were like total mental speculators, but at least they were thinking about it. And he had met Prabhupada in New York. He had been to India already. He knew how to play a harmonium and chant the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. So he came on also with Srila Prabhupada. So the whole scene was just so bizarre. The lights were down, and there were these kind of psychedelic lights. Means the lights were flashing in different meters, beats, And it would cause kind of your mind to get a little altered by the flashing of the lights in different ways. And all kinds of shadowy figures of stoned out hippies were there and filling every available space. Bodies were writhing in the darkness of the dance floor, pulsating light show. And the musical instruments were heavy on the reverb and the bass amped up to the max, coming from the bands who in those days, these bands were like the gods of the era. And each member was fully obliterated by the drug of their choice. So it was total madness, and everyone was surrendering into the illusory allurements of a variety of sense gratification activities. And into this bizarre scene walked the rising moon of Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement with this scruffy band of followers. Many of us had been in this very same place only until recently. And it was never very satisfying. So now here we were again. And it was absolutely surreal. The band stopped playing, clearing the stage for the next act, which was Swamiji. And he stood there silently on the stage, illuminated by a spotlight for some moments, his hands clasped in front of his chest. In spite of the artificial lighting, his presence was surrounded by a glowing aura that was distinctly different from the artificial illumination. And that was something that I experienced on the day he arrived at the airport in San Francisco. There was, in those days, they had big flashes on the cameras. There were big cameras, big flashes to provide light. And there was all this flashing and this brightness that kind of like blinded us. Well, at least it blinded me, and others reported the same. And we were thinking it was from the cameras, but actually it wasn't the cameras. There was just this incredible aura surrounding Srila Prabhupada, something we'd never seen or experienced before. So then he's standing there on that stage. He looks towards Allen Ginsberg, the hippie beat poet, and he indicated that Allen should speak first. I was looking on from a distance. I was in a balcony, and I felt like a helpless mother, unable to protect her fragile son. I'd also gone to this place many times, but I could never find my space, and I always left feeling alone and let down. And now it was supposed to be different. We came with something tangible to offer, but still it was awkward for both the givers and the receivers. Ginsberg gave an intro to the mantra, and Srila Prabhupada spoke of its importance, but sensing the complete inability of the audience to properly focus and hear, he was very brief and to the point, inviting them to sample the transcendence by chanting the Mahamantra. He was very brave that night, pure eloquence, pure elegance, and completely self-controlled in a situation where, in retrospect, we probably should not have brought him. After the kirtan, not directly referring to the sordid atmosphere, upon departure, he briefly turned around and commented, "This is no place for a brahmachari." And the next day, not losing sight of why we had gone to that place, he asked Sham Sundar and Mukunda, so how much money came, revealing his practical nature in connection with Krishna consciousness. They replied they'd have to check with me, since I had been managing the entry of the door. We cleared about $1,700, and that was a lot of money at that time. Srila Prabhupada was creative. He was an original creative thinker and planner, and an example of that creativity and original thinking was ISKCON and its deployment in the Western Hemisphere. Another quality was that he was intuitive. He would immediately sense something, often before it was revealed or known to others. In a personal example, we were in Surat in India, and I was confronted with a potentially life-changing situation that was not known to the others or Srila Prabhupada, and I was feeling adrift and distraught. There was a large darshan, and I came and I sat in the back by the door at the end of the room, kind of like in a shadowy corner. But after everybody left, I was still there, and I was about to leave when he called me forward and said, "Is there something?" And I blurted out my situation in 6 words, and he responded in 8. And in so doing, he completely adjusted the distressed situation to perfection before it even manifested. He was genuine. We have a saying in America, the real McCoy. It means authentic, the real deal. In the early San Francisco days, he was a guest on a radio show that featured live interviews. And even though we had warned him that the host of the show was known for his rude behavior toward guests, he agreed to go, noting that at least the radio audience would hear the names of Krishna. So after the interview, there was a period when the audience could call in with questions. And the first caller was a devotee. "Swamiji, what does it mean, Hare Krishna?" It was Gargamuni. And the next caller was a devotee. So the host suggested that we hear from someone else. And we're all thinking, oh God, now he's gonna jump in and start his verbal abuse of the guest, meaning Prabhupada. So it gets this, other person comes on the phone, and it was a lady, and she was very sarcastic, and she asked, "Swamiji, you came over on a ship with a free passage. So, are you a freeloader?" Freeloader is a very rude expression. But, derogatory. But Srila Prabhupada simply replied in an affirmative voice, "Yes." And then that MC, who was known for his caustic behavior towards guests, replied, "Well, that's enough of her," and he shut her off. In the presence of a pure devotee, even this person's heart was melted. He was so caring. He always asked. He would come, "Is everything all right?" He wanted to know how his disciples were. He would ask about the children. And how was Miss Saraswati? He was concerned that the Gurukul children were being well fed and getting sufficient rest. He would ask about our health, both men and women. When we began our preparation to go to London, I was pregnant, so he told Shamsundar, "Wait until Malati delivers her child and rest some before going." In New Vrindavan, he noticed one young lady in an outside darshan in the evening, so slightly chilly. So he sees this young lady, and he goes, Are you warm enough?" And she couldn't even imagine that he was speaking to her. She was way back in, the crowd of devotees, And she's kind of like, "Me? Yes, are you warm enough?" And then he turned to the temple president, who was Kaladri at the time, and he goes, "Once a month, you must ask the ladies if they have everything they need. You must ask them because they're shy. They will not say." He was so affectionate. Our lives were flooded with his affection. "As you are remembering me, I am remembering you," he said in a letter to Janaki and others. And in another letter to Jamuna, he wrote at the bottom, "How is Janaki, my naughty daughter?" He loved us as no one else, even our own parents had. And in turn, we loved him and trusted him completely by offering our lives to him to serve his mission. Sometimes people think that probably yogis, sannyasis, they're like mystics. Even I was thinking like that. When I was at the airport waiting for his arrival, in San Francisco, I started thinking, we probably didn't even have to send him a ticket. He probably could have just manifested himself. Normally he didn't outwardly exhibit any mystical behavior, but occasionally there would be something. On one occasion when I was present in a small Indian village, and sorry I don't remember the name, but some simple folks had arranged for a program. And while it was outdoors, it wasn't like one of our large pandal programs, as we called them, which were generally very loud and pompous with lots of action and ceremonies. There was only a rickety makeshift stage, a very Indian sound system, means it didn't work too well, and temporary outdoor lighting. There were a few chairs even, which was actually unusual for the situation, and otherwise there were duris, the cotton carpets on the ground. And the stage was really only a platform, only large enough to accommodate Srila Prabhupada. Generally, he liked to be surrounded by his devotees, but in this case, we were part of the audience. So there was a little break between Kirtan and Srila Prabhupada's lecture. And during this lull, some kind of action created a distraction. I was personally looking towards Srila Prabhupada and I couldn't see what was happening. But all of a sudden the lights went out and it was completely dark. Except that only Srila Prabhupada was visible. He was simply glowing by his effulgence. He was sitting very erect, like in a yogi pose, completely quiet. For some reason, I became a little fearful, but I couldn't identify the feelings, but still I started to rise up to go forward in case there was some need to protect him. I hadn't even fully stood up, and he saw me, and he indicated I should sit back down. I sat like a statue, holding my breath. I actually was unable to breathe, and I was wondering what was happening. And Srila Prabhupada was getting brighter and brighter. Now it was completely quiet. And everybody seemed to be caught up in a pose, like however you were, they were just stuck in that pose, like kind of like the game of statues, if you know that game. Suddenly, you know, you're all making a movement, and then suddenly and you have to just, whatever pose you're in. So everybody was like, all of a sudden, in that stillness, in all these awkward positions, the lights came on, and the sound returned, and Srila Prabhupada began speaking as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The only thing I could think of, this was the only way he could gain their attention, because now they were completely quiet and attentive. They were ready to hear the words spoken by a pure devotee. And that night he was lecturing in Hindi on their behalf. Just thinking, what time did I start speaking? Anyways, associating with Srila Prabhupada is essential. And we associate him now through his teachings, his books, his visual and audio media, and of course his devotees. Attachment, loyalty, and devotion come through service and keeping Srila Prabhupada and Krishna in the center of our activities. I can say a few other small incidents. Srila Prabhupada and using his qualities. So one is, he was always appreciative. In fact, one time he was so happy to see Krishna in Los Angeles. He asked, "Who has dressed Krishna today? Bring her immediately." And he told the pujari, "Krishna is looking beautiful. Thank you very much." And he gave her $20. Now, nobody ever feels you should take money from your spiritual master. But Prabhupada's offering it. And in this case, the devotee was a temple devotee. She didn't have any personal funds, and she had a desire to get something special for Prabhupada. She already knew what it was, and the cost was $20. So Prabhupada just fulfilled her desire to serve him by giving her $20. And he told her, always serve Krishna, and this life will be perfect, and next life will also be perfect, because you'll go back home, back to Godhead. When my daughter was 5.5, she had been in Gurukul for 1 year. She went to Gurukul from Calcutta at the age of 4.5. So now, a year later, 5.5, she flew alone from Dallas to New York to London, and London to Delhi. Srila Prabhupada was alone in a small room at our little, 10 more minutes, okay, in a small room in the little temple in Delhi, in an area called Bengali Market. It was just a small little place, but even so, their beautiful forms were there. Parthasarati. I had picked Saraswati up from the airport, and he heard her voice, and he calls us in, and he goes, so, you are now in Gurukul. Have you learned Sanskrit? Yes, she said. Recite something. And she recited the first verse of the Bhagavatam, and he was so pleased with her, he asked me to bring his famous small white bag, and he unzipped it and gave me 20 rupees, which in those days had a value. He said, buy her some new cloth. There's a picture of her putting a garland on Srila Prabhupada on the stage during the second Delhi Pandal, and she's wearing the little red and white mirrored Rajasthani skirt that I had purchased from Connaught Circus with that $20. He was always grateful. He was grateful that Krishna had sent devotees to help him. One time he said, I required first-class men, but Krishna has only sent fifth-class men. What can I do? But he was grateful. And he called us, that he said that we were sent by his spiritual master to help him. One time, Harsharani, a young disciple who was initiated at the same time as myself, wrote a poem. And we were thinking it was kind of maybe a little childish. She was describing playing with Krishna, running in the forest barefoot. With the last line, always thinking of what he can do in the service of his dearmost friend, Krishna, and never wanting anything else in return. Prabhupada heard the poem. And to our surprise, he said, print it in the Back to Godhead. About gratitude, he said, birds and beasts cannot offer gratitude, but I am a human being. I have got developed consciousness. I must feel grateful for God's mercy and offer my gratitude. That is my duty. I realize that I'm thinking, what can I say in an hour? But I can realize that Srila Prabhupada is so magnificent, and he's ever fresh. And the memories of Prabhupada are sparked by speaking about him, and they start flooding back. But I think my time is up now. And on the occasion of his 125th Appearance Day, it is my prayer that somehow or other, more and more persons will come to his lotus feet, and more persons will get a taste of this most radical personality, extraordinarily, wonderfully radical personality, Srila Prabhupada, who was managing an entire global organization, and at the same time, always had a moment for his devotees. Hare Krishna.